Hi, boys and girls. It's Mr. Wasemann again, and we are continuing the drafting of our famous Hoosier biographies. I am on the slide entitled Beginning, and it's the second part of this section of our biography before our famous Hoosiers become famous. If you recall, when we were doing our research, we acknowledged that not every question that we could ask about a person's life would have an answer that correlates with the question. Sometimes questions don't necessarily apply to a topic. If you recall, one example I used was that the Miami chief Little Turtle, who grew up in the 1700s, did not attend any kind of formal school because they didn't exist back then. So asking when he graduated from high school wouldn't make sense. So when you were asked to research, you were asked to at least come up with 2 more facts that you could apply to your biography. Now, I was able to find quite a bit of information about Steve McQueen, so I answered every question in the pick 2 category. But as you can see, I highlighted a couple of the answers in red because if I were studying a different topic, I might not necessarily have found information about those questions. So for our purposes, I'm going to pretend I didn't. So I'm only going to look at these 4 boxes that have text in black. So when I look at my text box on my slide, there's these 6 bullet points. So if I only have answers for 2 or 3 or 4 of those questions, those are the only things I'm going to include. I am not going to say he did not have any hobbies because I couldn't find any. I'm just going to not mention that. It's kind of like if I were to offer you a chocolate chip cookie and not have any cookies to offer. That would just not make any sense. So why bring up the concept of a chocolate chip cookie if I have none to share? So if I don't have an answer to a question, I'm not going to mention that question in my writing. So I'm going to start by moving my cursor into the top of my text box, and I'm going to change the text size to 14. And let's look at the first fact. The places where my famous Hoosier lived, including dates. Now, Steve McQueen moved around a lot as a kid. He bounced around between his mother's house, and she moved quite a bit, and his great uncle's farm in Slater, Missouri. So I want to incorporate that in sentence form. I don't want to just make a list of all the places where Steve McQueen lived at one point. So I'm going to have to do some drafting. So let's start out with the simple narrative. Steve McQueen moved around a lot as a kid. After his father left his mother, Julianne had a hard time raising Steve on her own. So when Steve was about 4 years old, he was sent to live with his great-grand-uncle Claude on a farm in Slater, Missouri. He lived there for several years off and on. And let's double check our notes. 1933 was the first time he lived there, and then he went back again and lived there from 1939 to 1942. Okay, so let's read what I've written so far. Steve McQueen moved around a lot as a kid. After his father left his mother, Julian had a hard time raising Steve on her own. So when Steve was about 4 years old, he was sent to live with his great-grand-uncle Claude on a farm in Slater, Missouri. He lived there for several years, off and on, from 1933 through 1942, occasionally moving back to live with his mother. When he was, let's see, about 12, because he was born in 1930. If he moved to Los Angeles in 1942, he rejoined his mother, who was now living in Los Angeles. However, Steve often got into a lot of trouble. Now, as you can see, my text box is now starting to fill up the space. It's pushed all the bullet points down into this area where there should be a picture. Now, this requires me to make a decision about layout. Now, there's a couple things that I can do here. One is I can choose to eliminate one picture from this space. So I can take this box and just delete it, and that would leave me more space to write text. That's one thing I could do. Or what I could do is I could decide to create a new slide and continue with my story. Now I'm going to show you how to do that here. So here I am, slide number 5, the beginning. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on that slide. It's going to give me a number of choices here. And one of the things I can do is I can duplicate that slide. And what that does for me is it creates an exact copy of the slide that I just created or just worked on right here. So now I have two of the very same slide. Now you might be wondering, why do I want two of the same thing? Well, in the second slide, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the text that I just got done typing because I have it in this slide. Now I want to remember that I'm continuing to write about Steve McQueen's story. And I've already mentioned that he lived in a lot of different places growing up. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell a little bit more of his story. At one point, Steve McQueen got into trouble with the law, and he was sent to basically a reform school. It was like a boarding school for troubled kids, and he spent about 3 years there. So I'm going to want to mention that because that had a profound impact on him. So after getting in trouble with the law, Steve was sent to live at. Since I took the time to write this out, I'm going to just copy my fact by Control-C. I'm just going to paste this here. I'm going to make it look like it matches, so I'm going to change the size, change the fact that it's not italicized or bold, and I'm going to change the color to white. Steve was sent to live at, let's put in an article, the California Junior Boys Republic Reform School in Chino Hills, California, and I'll add in the word from 1942 to 1944. Okay. When he was released from reform school, Steve what did he do? He briefly served in the Merchant Marines and worked as a lumberjack, carnival barker, and on an oil rig. Okay, so again, I've got this information here, and since I'm not the world's best typist, I'm going to do a little copying and pasting. But I have to expand upon what I wrote because these aren't necessarily complete sentences. I need to make sure that what I write matches and flows with what I've already included. So I'm going to take out the capital. And then cut that apart into a separate sentence. When he was released from reform school, Steve briefly served in the Merchant Marines. He also worked as a lumberjack, carnival barker, and on an oil rig. Eventually, Steve enlisted with the. So I've changed some wording. When you join the armed services, you enlist. Basically, you volunteer to join. So Steve enlisted with the Marines and served from 1947 to 1950. He never graduated from high school. Okay, so now I have incorporated some interesting facts about Steve's life prior to him breaking into the movies. Okay, so I can now delete all this information that's underneath right here where it says text. So I'm just going to delete all that. There we go. I'm just going to remember to keep a box right there to remind me at some point I want a picture to live right there. Okay, so let's go back and take a look at what I've done. So now I have two more slides where I used to have just one. And I have a bunch of information. Oops, I don't want to take it all out. Get to see me compose a little on the fly here. So now I have information about Steve's childhood beyond who his parents were and what his birth date was and all that. So that gives us a bit of a sense of what he was like as a kid. So now I need to move on to what led him to his career that made him famous. Okay, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, we will talk again soon. Thank you.